In Ansible, reading files on your local control machine into variables is trivial. But what if you want to read the contents of a file on a remote host into a variable and use it in your Ansible code? In this video, I'll show you the 3 best Ansible modules you can use to read plain text, JSON or YAML files on remote hosts into variables. G'day everyone, I'm Percy from TopTechSkills.com, and I'm here to help you build great software systems with programming and DevOps. Let's jump into VS Code and get started. I'm in VS Code now, and let's start with the most basic example of reading a file from a remote host into a variable. In this first example, we'll use the Slurp module to read a plain text file on the target host and print it to the output. In my playbook, I'll add a new task called Read Plain Text File from Host and select the ansible.builtin.slurp module. The Slurp module reads a file on a remote host and expects a source parameter with the file's absolute path on the remote host. Let's choose a plain text file that will already be in place and unique to the host. In my dev environment here, I've got 2 Ubuntu Jammy virtual machines that I launched with Vagrant, one with the host name remote0 and an IP of 10.0.0.2, and another with the host name remote1 and an IP of 10.0.0.3. This is a really simple but powerful setup for local Ansible development. If you want to see how I set it up, I'll walk through all the steps in the free part of my Ansible course, Productive with Ansible, which I'll link to in the description. A file that will be unique to each of these VMs is the etc hostname file, which is just a plain text file that contains the hostname of the host. I'll set the source parameter of the Slurp module to etc hostname. To get the task to store its output into a variable, I'll add a register key at the task indentation level and set the variable name to slurp_result. I'll add another task called print result. Select the ansible.builtin.debug module and set the var parameter to slurp result. This playbook is good to go, so let's run it and see what we get. I'll be using the built-in terminal in VS Code, which I can bring up with my shortcut key. In the terminal, I'll run ansible-playbook, playbook.yaml. In the output for each host, we get a dictionary with the contents of our file in the content key as a base64 encoded string. The fact that the content is returned as a base64 encoded string is a gotcha that can easily catch you out, so remember to be careful of this. Let's base64 decode the content and print the raw value. Back in the playbook, I'll add a new task called print raw string, and once again select the ansible.builtin.debug module. This time I'll use the message key and set the value to a template string containing slurp_result.content, and then pipe it to the B64 decode ginger2 filter, which will base64 decode our string. I'll bring up my terminal and rerun the playbook. This time our final task outputs the raw string it read from the file, which was remote0 for 10.0.0.2 and remote1 for 10.0.0.3. Let's adapt the playbook and see how you can use the Slurp module to easily read in data structures from JSON or YAML files. I'll start by duplicating the playbook in my sidebar on the left and calling the new file playbook_json.yaml. In the file, I'll replace both instances of plain text with JSON since we'll be reading from a JSON file with this playbook. I'll go ahead and set the path for the source parameter to a file path I'll show in a moment. The file's called slurp.json in the home directory of the Vagrant user on the VM, so I'll set the source to home vagrant slurp.json. I've already created a JSON file on both hosts, so let's take a quick look at the contents on both of them. I'll SSH into 10.0.0.2 in the built-in terminal and load up slurp.json in Vim. We've got a JSON object with 2 keys, each containing the hostname of the host. I'll save, quit, and log out of the VM, and then SSH into 10.0.0.3. Looking at the contents of slurp.json on this host, you can see it has exactly the same structure, but with remote1 instead of remote0. I'll save, quit, and log out to get back to my host machine. I'll go ahead and run the playbook in its current form and see what we get. In the output, I can see that we've actually got structured data printed out by the debug module, meaning that Ansible has automatically passed the JSON into a native dictionary. This might not be the case in your version of Ansible, so you should always use the from_JSON ginger2 filter to make sure that the JSON string is passed correctly. It's also a good idea to assign the passed data into a variable so you can easily access its keys with dot notation. I'll create a new task called load data into variable and select the ansible.builtin.setFact module. I'll call the variable my_var and then cut and paste the value from the print raw string task. At the end of the template string, I'll pipe the value to the from_JSON filter to ensure it's correctly passed. Now that we've loaded the data into a variable, we can easily access the keys in the JSON object by using dot notation. I'll change the print raw string task to use the var parameter and set the value to my_var.key0. Then I'll rerun the playbook in my terminal. In the output, you can see that we've printed just the value of key0 of the JSON object from both remote hosts. Doing the same thing with a YAML file is almost exactly the same. I'll duplicate the playbook again and call this one playbook_YAML.YAML. In the contents of the playbook, I'll select all 4 instances of the string JSON with multiple cursors and change them to YAML. So we're now reading slurp.yaml and passing the contents with the from_YAML ginger2 filter. Once again, I've already put the slurp.yaml file in place on both hosts. SSHing into 10.0.0.2 and loading up the file in Vim, you can see the structure is exactly the same as our JSON object, but in YAML form. Logging out of this host and bringing up the slurp.yaml file on the other host, you can see that the structure is the same, but with remote 1 instead of remote 0. I'll log out and then go ahead and run this playbook in my terminal. In the output, I can see that we get the exact same results as our JSON playbook, but we're now reading from a YAML data file. So the Slurp module is pretty useful, but I mentioned that you can do this with 3 different modules. The other 2 modules are the command and shell modules, which could give you a lot more power and flexibility. The command and shell modules allow you to execute arbitrary commands on the remote host and capture the output, which you can easily adapt to read the contents of remote files into Ansible variables. Let's start with the command module. I'll duplicate our most recent playbook and call the new one playbook_command.yaml. In the file, I'll change the module of the first task to be ansible.builtin.command. We need a command on the remote system that will print the contents of the YAML file as standard out, which is exactly what the cat command does on Linux. I'll simply change the command to be cat home vagrant slurp.yaml. I'll change all the instances of slurp_result into command_result using multiple cursors. The command module outputs standard out into a standard out key rather than a content key, so I'll change the .content to .standardout in our setFact task, and also remove the B64 decode filter since the command module returns its data unencoded. I'll bring up my terminal and run the playbook_command.yaml playbook. In the output, we get exactly the same results, showing that the command module is functionally equivalent to the Slurp module for reading remote data into a variable. Using the shell module instead of the command module gives us some extra capabilities, since we can use pipes and redirects to do extra processing or filtering. I'll go ahead and duplicate the command playbook and call the new one playbook_shell.yaml. Then go ahead and replace all instances of command in the file with shell. Let's go ahead and do some additional filtering of the output from cat by piping it to grep and grepping for the string key0. This should work the same as before, so I'll bring up my terminal and run the playbook_shell.yaml playbook. We can see that the final output is exactly the same as before, but if we scroll up, we can see that the standard out of the shell result variable only contains data for key0 and nothing for key1 as a result of piping it to grep. If I change the last task to print the value for key1, then rerun the playbook in the terminal, we get a variable is not defined message indicating that this key doesn't exist on the myvar variable. With 3 different modules you can use to achieve the same goal, which one should you use? In my opinion, if all you're trying to do is read data from a file into a variable, the Slurp module is the safest way to do it, since you're not executing arbitrary code on the remote host. That said, the shell module is the most flexible, allowing you to not only read data from files, but also process and filter that data using all the tools you have available on the remote shell, such as grep, jq, sed, and awk. Be careful to escape your variables with the quote filter if you decide to use the shell module, since otherwise you could be vulnerable to injection. If you'd like to become an Ansible Pro by using it to build some real-world projects and support me at the same time, I've dropped a link to my course Productive with Ansible in the description. I've also dropped a link to all the code for this video on GitHub. Thanks a lot for watching, and I hope you found this video useful.